Linda is in the state of California, and you're up next with Tim. Hi, Linda.
Hi.
Hi.
Thank you. My question is, could you shed some light on, or how would you answer Catholics who say the Novus Ordo Mass is not licit? They didn't say invalid. They just said there were things wrong with it.
Right. Yes. What I would do, Linda, and believe me, I do this all the time, and I have for many years, is I ask them to specify what is it about the Mass that you would say is illicit, because you really have to get from them what it is that they're talking about. I could throw out some examples of things that I know they would say. For example, in the words of institution, before the Mass of Paul VI or the new Roman Missal was promulgated in 1969, you used to have within the words of institution, the priest would say the mystery of faith, mysterium fidei. And during the reforms of Vatican II, they rightly took that out, and this was one of the many good reforms that happened as a result of Vatican II and then the post-conciliar documents, because that's not found in any of the institution narratives that we find in the Gospels or in the book of Acts. It's not found in any of the Eastern rites. None of them have that mysterium fidei, so it was removed from there and made an acclamation after the words of institution. So now we have the congregation announcing the mystery of faith. Christ has died, Christ is risen, that sort of thing.
Right.
Now, they would argue that the Pope did not have the authority to do that because, Pope St. Pius V in Quo Primum, when he promulgated what we call now the Tridentine Mass, or the Mass of St. Pius V, said in that document that no one has the authority to change, I don't have the document in front of me, but in not so many words, he says words to the effect of, no one has the authority to change this. Now, unfortunately, that's a fundamental blunder on the part of these folks who don't understand that Quo Primum was principally a juridical document. So the popes always use the language that no one has the authority to change this because he's exercising his authority as pope. But it's understood that he doesn't have the power to bind a pope, a future pope, to that which is by nature malleable. It's by nature changeable because it is juridical in nature. So there's a fundamental misunderstanding of Quo Primum that then leads to folks saying, well, then the Pope has no authority to change this all these centuries later. And the problem with that is, Linda, there were changes made in the Tridentine Mass many times over the centuries, last by Pope Pius XII, in the 1940s, 1950s. So, again, what I would say, Linda, is you take them one by one, find out, okay, what is it that you say is illicit? Let's talk about it, and we can do it one by one. Now, there's a great book I would recommend by James Locutus and Kenneth Whitehead that goes through these wonderfully, again, by James Locutus, that's Likoudis, and Kenneth Whitehead. The book is called The Pope, the Council, and the Mass. In fact, they just had a few years ago a new edition of that book come out. I have both the old and the new. It's outstanding. But it'll go through just about every point anybody who calls into question the laicity of the Novus Ordo is going to make. But does that help at all, Linda?
Yeah, it does. One thing that was mentioned was,
Yes.
The direction, the east, and
Yes.
Should we be facing God or facing the people? And I think that my thought on that was that Jesus gave us two commandments: love the Lord thy God, and the other one was your neighbor as yourself.
Yes.
And there's room enough for all of us in here. Some people go for the one direction, and some people go the other direction.
Well, that's a good way to put it, Linda. What's happening here is we're majoring on the minors. Now, I happen to agree, and by the way, so did Pope Benedict XVI, and so does Cardinal Arinze and others, that we should, in fact, face ad orientem, as we say, or to the east. It's a very ancient tradition, a rich tradition. In fact, I'd recommend Pope Benedict, then Cardinal Ratzinger's book, The Spirit of the Liturgy, where he makes the argument for that. And I think there is a good argument for the good and the truth of having the priest facing to the east, but that is not part of the essence of the liturgy that is unchangeable. So even though we can say, wow, there's something lost in losing this, and there's much to be said in its favor, like you said, Linda, that's not a hill to die on, and it's certainly not something to separate over, and it's absolutely not a reason to say that the Mass of Paul VI is then illicit.
Okay, Linda?
Thank you very much.
All right, thanks.
You're very welcome.